Welcome to video number 33 in the Using iTrain tutorial series. My name is Bob. In a change to what was advertised, in this tutorial we're going to show a few more things about permissions. Welcome back. We saw in the last tutorial that the station selection parameter in the station properties here determines how iTrain selects a block within the station during automatic routing. We confirmed that selection is only active when a wait has been specified for the blocks within the station or for the train type within the station. Otherwise, the selection parameter is ignored. And we demonstrated that block selection can be affected by the block order, by the status of the individual wait parameters for the block, by the direction of the block. In other words, the selection is direction sensitive. And we saw that block selection is affected by the various permissions tabs in the Locomotive's trains and train types editors. For example, here's the permissions tab here. All of these factors that can affect the block selection apply to all 6 of these different options for the selection criteria. And I was intending to run through the 5 remaining options here in this tutorial. But after replaying the last tutorial, it became apparent that certain points regarding the permissions would benefit from further explanation. So we will tackle those additional points in this tutorial and then run through the 5 remaining options in the next tutorial. Okay, so if we look at a permissions tab in any of the 3 editors here, let's choose the Locomotives. If we look at the permissions tab, you'll see that there are 2 options that we can select: the no access to or the only access to. The permissions tab allows us to specify blocks that we don't want, in this case the Locomotive, to go into, or we can select blocks that the Locomotive only has access to. No access to means that the Locomotive, train or train type will not have access to one or more specified blocks. And this is typically the option that we would choose when using the permissions tab. Only access to means that the loco, train or train type will literally only have access to the blocks listed here. So if we wanted to use only access to with automatic routing without a route, we would need to list every block in the path from the starting position to the end of the route. Otherwise, the route will not operate and we will see a route not possible message. You cannot, for example, do this. So select one block within the station that we only want the Locomotive in this instance to have access to. That simply won't work. Let's use an example to demonstrate it. Let's say, for example, that we wanted to try and use only access to restrict iTrain to only accessing block 3 in a station for the train DB car. The train is already on the layout, so we can open the editor by right-clicking on it here, going to Properties, and then selecting the train editor from the list here. We select the Permissions tab, click on Only Access To, click on Append, then in the selection box we pick B3 and click OK. And then as soon as we hit the Start button for DB car, we get the route not possible from this position message. Why do we get that message? Well, it's because in the permissions we said that DB car only has access to block 3, B3. The train can't get to block 3 because we haven't stipulated block 6, or maybe there are multiple blocks between the current location and B3. So if we wanted to use only access to, for example, to restrict a tram on a large layout to using a specific section of track, then we would need to list every block in the route. Okay, so here's another point about the permissions. If you see here, we've got a column called Direction. This allows us to make the permissions direction sensitive if we want to. Its default is both, so that the rule, whatever we apply as the rule here, in this case would be applied no matter which direction the train enters the block. The rule will apply in both directions. But we can make it direction sensitive by double clicking on it, and then we can select either next or previous as the direction in which the rule will apply. Let's create another example. We'll remove the only access to block, so we just type the remove button. We'll select no access, click append, and we have B1 selected. So here we are denying access to B1 in both directions for this train DB car. We click OK to save it. We'll clear the error that we had from the last example by double clicking on it down here. The block order in the station is block 1, 2 and 3 in that order, and we have denied access to block 1. So when we press play, block 2 is selected because we've denied access to block 1. And if we stop the route and then put the train into reverse gear, so that the train is now going to enter from this direction, we press play and we see that we are denied access to block 1 again, so it has chosen block 2. Now if we open the properties by right clicking anywhere in the throttle here above this train, we can then go to DB Car's Permission tab, and this time we'll change it to direction next. So in the direction next, we will not have access to block 1. Let's check that that is the case. Click OK. So direction next is in the clockwise direction on this layout. We are currently in the reverse gear, so we're going to be entering the block from this direction. So what do you think? Will we get access to block 1 or will it choose block 2? Let's try it. It's allowed us to choose block 1 because we stated that we cannot have access to block 2 when we're going in the direction next. We're going in the opposite direction, so it allows us access to it. And then if we put it into forward gear and try this time, you see it doesn't allow us access into block 1 and we go into block 2. So it is now direction sensitive. Okay, hopefully that is explained okay. Right, okay, so the last thing I want to talk about regarding permissions is the hierarchy that exists between locomotive, train and train type permissions. Now this may already seem obvious to you, but I'm going to go through it anyway because it's important that we do understand this. And in fact, we should not forget that there is actually a fourth category that has a permissions tab, and that is the wagons. If we look at the wagons editor, you'll see that that also has a permissions tab. Wagons are at the bottom of the hierarchy and train types are at the top. But these could all be overruled by the station parameters. Here's a slide to try and illustrate what I mean. This is a hierarchy chart, and some of you may know it better as a family tree. At the top we have the station, and then under the station we have the various train types shown here. Below that we have the various trains, and these are all the train names, and then below that we have the locomotives that drive each of the trains, and below that we have the wagons. The B1, B2 and B3 refer to the block numbers within this station, which can be selected from the various permissions tabs. So we saw there's a permissions tab for the train type, for the trains, for the locomotives and for the wagons. And within that permissions tab we've got selection of the 3 blocks within this station that we could choose from. There are of course other blocks outside of the station, but for simplicity I have just listed the 3 blocks within the station because we are focusing on the hierarchy within the station boundaries. So at the moment, for example, the train DB car is a cargo type train, and the train consists of the locomotive DB360 and any wagons that may be attached to it. Now the arrangement could be different. For example, we could make the class 33 part of the cargo classification, in which case the arrangement would look like this. Now the class 33 is under the tree for the cargo, and its locomotives and wagons have moved across with it. Now let's see what happens if we edit the permissions for this wagon to deny access into B2. So we would go into the wagon properties, onto the permissions tab, and we would append B2. And I've indicated that with the red cross here to show that there is no access to B2. And by association, there would also be no access to B2 for the locomotive and for the train, as indicated by the orange crosses here. This is by association, or indirectly the train and the locomotive cannot access B2 because the train is composed of these three parts. Let's set up that scenario in this example. So we can go to the class 33. If we double click on the little white button, it expands out to show the complete contents of the train. We can then right click on the coach here and select properties, and in here we can then append in the permissions tab and set B2 as no access. Click OK. Then we can right click on the train, select its properties and make sure it has nothing in there, which it does. And for the class 33 type, train type, we also want to make sure that is clear. So all we have is the coach, which is denied access to block 2. And if we now press the play button, you'll see that it selects block 1 because that is the first block in the list. But if we simulate block 1 being occupied by alt clicking on block 1, you see it's gone grey. That's effectively saying that this block is occupied. Now if we click the start button, you'll see that it has no access to block 2 and has chosen block 3, purely because the train cannot go into here because of the association with the coach. And a similar thing would happen if we had set the permissions up for the locomotive instead of the wagon. So in that case we would go into the locomotive's properties, to the permissions tab, and set B2 here for no access. So the red cross is across the B2 here, and by association the train type and the wagon type would not get access to that block because they all form that train. And something to be careful of, if you decide to decouple the locomotive or the wagon and attach it to a different train, then any of these settings for that locomotive or wagon will transfer to that train as well. So if DB car or another train suddenly starts not accessing B2, it's because you transferred the settings with it. Now let's see what happens if we denied the access actually in the train. So in the permissions for the train this time, we set B2 as no access, and the permissions for the locomotive and the wagons would be empty, or they could be set as well. It would make no difference. because by association these would all be denied access to B2. Now let's say we cleared all of the permissions tabs for these three, so they're all empty, and we now set the permissions in the train type for cargo so that B2 is denied access there. Now by association, not only does the class 33 and its locomotives and wagons not have access to B2, but DB car and its locomotive and wagons would also not get access to B2. And this is where the hierarchy really kicks in. Let's set up that scenario. So we'll clear the access that we had in here by just clicking on it and clicking remove. The permissions tab for the loco is clear, and it is for the properties of the train as well. Yep. So if we now go into the train type editor, train types, and click on cargo, and then select no access in the permissions tab, click append, then we select block 2. Block 1 was grayed out, by the way, because we had disabled the block up here earlier. So we've got block 2 in there. We click apply. Now when we press the start button, oh, let's close this first. If we press the start button for the class 33 first, we see that it has chosen block 3 because block 1 is disabled. We're simulating it is occupied. The permissions for the cargo type trains has denied access to block 2, so it can only go into block 3. And the same now also applies to DB car, which is also a cargo train. You see the types are both cargo down here, and it cannot get access to block 1 and block 2, so goes to block 3. And this is jumping ahead a little, but we can even go higher in the tree and disable block 2 in the station. And when we do that, we actually disable access to B2 for all of the train types that are allowed in this station. And we disable block 2 by going to the blocks tab and then removing the weight from B2. So the box has been unticked here. Now we're not actually disabling block 2. That's probably the wrong term to use. What we're doing is removing the weight from block 2. But it's effectively disabled because without a weight being specified for this block, iTrain will ignore this block as a place to stop in the station. Now we haven't covered the blocks tab fully in the tutorials yet, and it will be one of the future tutorials that we're going to do. So I'm not going to talk any more about those, but it just gives you an example of how we can globally affect the whole of the station. And it shows how the hierarchy can filter down from the top to the bottom. Okay, so that was all that we wanted to cover in this tutorial regarding permissions. We saw the difference between no access and only access to. We saw that we can make the permissions direction sensitive by the direction column here, where we could select both next or previous. We saw that there were permissions tabs for train types, trains, locomotives, and a fourth category which was the wagons. And we saw that there is a hierarchy from stations down to wagons. So in the next tutorial we really will move on to the station selections and have a look at what all of these other 5 options can do. Hope to see you then. Thanks for watching.